What's going on, everybody? This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. In today's video, we are talking about the book of Revelation, and this is part 2 in this series. So in the last video we did that was published last weekend, we talked about the 4 views of interpretation of the book of Revelation. That was laying the groundwork for this series, which is going to be a few videos long. As I've been looking at my notes, it may take a little bit longer to go through it than even the 2 or 3 videos I mentioned, but we're just going to take it one video at a time and see how it goes. But as I said before, in our video last week, we talked about the 4 views, the schools of interpretation for the book of Revelation. We talked about preterism, which interprets everything primarily in the context of 70 AD, and there's partial preterism and full preterism. We talked about futurism, which is essentially the dispensationalist view, and they interpret the vast majority of the book of Revelation in the context of the Great Tribulation, a 7-year tribulation that they see coming in the near future. It's usually dispensationalist futurists believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, and they're looking for one messianic political figure to rise up as the Antichrist. And then there's the idealist school, which essentially interprets the book of Revelation in a very symbolic manner, where everything is very general symbolism, which they say symbolizes various things such as tribulation for the church or persecution or whatever else it may be. And they see these themes intensifying as the church age progresses, but they really avoid specific literal historical events in their interpretation of the book of Revelation. So the idealist school is very symbolic. Some people would even go as far to say it's allegorical, even though idealists themselves would not like that terminology applied to their school of interpretation. And then finally, there's the historicist school. That's the school I adhere to. We're going to talk about that more today. And this school of interpretation believes that the book of Revelation is a timeline from the first coming of Christ to the end of the world, and that church Bible prophecy is fulfilled by literal historical events, and it's fulfilled progressively as the centuries march on. So the earlier parts of the book of Revelation would have been fulfilled in the first century AD or in the early centuries relate in the time of the pagan Roman Empire. And then as time progresses, you move into the Middle Ages and the papal Roman system. And then you get into moving in more toward the modern age as you come into the latter portions of the book of Revelation. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And I said that the principle of prophetic interpretation for historicism is that some prophecies have been fulfilled in the past, some prophecies are being fulfilled in the present tense, and then some prophecies are still waiting to be fulfilled in the future. So historicism is a school of thought that really looks at, depending on what prophecy you're looking at, some of it's fulfilled in the past, some of it in the present day, and then some of it in the future. So that's really the recap of what we covered last week, and that really brings us up to what we're talking about this week. So what we're going to be talking about specifically today is I'm going to be talking about the date of the book of Revelation, which shouldn't take very long. We're going to talk about the structure of the book of Revelation, talking about the epistles and the seals and the trumpets and the vials. And then we're going to start to get into the nitty-gritty of how I personally interpret the 7 epistles, and we're going to be talking about that today. So that's really what is on deck for this video, and depending on how long this video is, we'll see whether maybe in the next week we may cover the seals and the trumpets, or maybe it's just the seals, and then there'll be a video on the vials at some point, and then I'm going to cover the millennium and the eternal state at the end of the book too. But we're going to take it one video at a time. But really the goal is to get through the structure of the book of Revelation today and the 7 epistles in the first chapter. So that's really what we're talking about today. Now, I just said a moment ago that the book of Revelation, according to the historicist school of interpretation, says that some prophecies have been fulfilled in the past, some prophecies have been fulfilled in the present day, and some prophecies are going to be fulfilled in the future. That's the historicist mindset. And depending on when you live in history, so if we had lived farther back in history, like I said before, more of the book of Revelation would have been waiting to be fulfilled. But if you're later in history, more of it will already have been fulfilled. And obviously, it takes discernment from the Holy Spirit, and it takes an understanding of history to interpret the book of Revelation if you believe this is the correct school of thought, because it requires a knowledge of history, because this is a belief that prophecy is fulfilled by literal historical events. So before I get to the date of the book of Revelation, I just really want to quickly turn to Revelation chapter 1 and give two verses that show why I think this is the correct way to be thinking about the book. Because I want to read Revelation chapter 1 verse 3, and then I'm going to read Revelation chapter 1 verse 19. And then this says, "Blessed is he that readeth, and that he that hears the words of prophecy, and keeps those things that are written therein, for the time is at hand." So the book of Revelation says that this is a prophecy that is supposed to be unsealed at the time of its writing. In contrast to, for example, if you read the prophecies in the book of Daniel, you'll read that this is for a latter time. We're in, I think it's in Daniel 12, but you could quote me. But in the prophecies of Daniel, there's statements that'll say, "Seal it up, Daniel, for the time is not yet at hand." And that's really in contrast to the book of Revelation. So that really says that at least some of the prophecy in the book was in the context of the first century, that the prophecy started to be fulfilled in the first century, and and according to the historicist view, it marches on to the end of time. Now, a partial preterist, they would like at least in part what I just said here, because if I said that this prophecy is at hand for the readers of the first century, someone in the preterist school is obviously going to like that, because they see the vast majority of the prophecies being fulfilled leading up to 70 AD. But obviously here we see that this prophecy, according to the way I'm looking at it, is, yeah, it's being fulfilled progressively, but it certainly starts in the first century. But then also, if you look at verse 3, this may sound somewhat simple, but it says, "Blessed that he that reads and hears the words of this prophecy." So the book of Revelation defines itself as a prophecy. And I know that may sound kind of simple or even simplistic, but that's an important observation, because that is how the book of Revelation defines itself, and it's good to lay that groundwork. And this is part of the reason why I like the historicist school of thought, is because I would say that we should interpret Bible prophecy in the book of Revelation the same way we interpret Bible prophecy in the rest of Scripture, such as other books as the book of Daniel, or the other major and minor prophets in the Old Testament, or the other prophecies we find in the New Testament. We should interpret the book of Revelation with a methodology, with a school of interpretive thought that is consistent with how we interpret it with the rest of the scriptures. And I would say that that means that the interpretation of the prophecies, even though they are written in symbolism, they're going to be interpreted by literal historical fulfillments. That they're fulfilled. These prophecies are fulfilled by the progression of the literal historical events that happen in the providence of God in history. So I think when you look at verse 3, there's some nuggets we can pull out of that to support that train of thought. But I think it's even stronger in verse 19, and the words of Jesus here. And it says, "Write the things which thou hast seen, and the things that which are, and the things which shall be thereafter." So when we look at verse 19, we see that it's saying John's going to see things in the past, things in the present, things in the future. Now, this prophecy is essentially, it's a prophecy from his day into the future. So from where John was writing the book in the first century AD, it's a prophecy of things that are going to happen in his time, and then also prophecies that are going to happen after his time. And that lines up with a historicist school of thought, and that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, write the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. Now, the next question we got to come to is the dating of the book of Revelation. Now, the partial preterist, and the full preterist for that matter, the preterist school of thought is the school of thought that really believes and emphasizes that the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD. They usually believe it was written around 66 AD in the reign of the Emperor Nero, and this is instrumental to their school of thought because they believe that the prophecies in the book of Revelation are being fulfilled in the first century AD, and that it's prophesying things such as the tribulation that came upon Jerusalem leading up to 70 AD. They think the beast in Revelation is referring to the pagan Roman Empire, and they see the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. No, usually it's interpreted as the Emperor Nero. So if the book of Revelation is not written before 70 AD, their entire school of thought essentially falls apart. Their argument is really truly hinged upon an early date for the book of Revelation. Now, for all the other schools, even though most other schools will generally, I say generally, will give the book of Revelation a later date. Most interpreters in the other schools, and I hold to this view, is that the book of Revelation was written around 96 AD in the reign of the Emperor Domitian. And it's interesting that all the other schools, if they were to concede that the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD, it really wouldn't unhinge their arguments in of itself. But preterism is unique in that their argument really depends on an earlier date for the book of Revelation. So if you come to the view that the book of Revelation is written later, what we call a later dater, which is kind of fun to say, a later dater, if you are a later dater, then what it means is that holding to the preterist school of thought is going to be very, very difficult, if not fully impossible. So I'm not going to get too caught in the weeds on this, but I'm going to give just one argument, one example of why I think it was written in 96 AD and not in the 60s AD. And one example is we have a quotation from Irenaeus of Lyon, who was he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, who wrote the book. John the Apostle. He wrote it on the Isle of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, and he was essentially exiled there. And he wrote it from facing persecution, and all of his contemporary apostles who had been with Christ, they had all essentially been martyred and killed off. He's really, if you believe in the church traditions, the oral accounts of what happened, most church historians would believe he's the last one. I think that's true. But Irenaeus of Lyon, who is one generation removed from the Apostle John, I don't have the quote in front of me here, but if you read his writings, he testifies that he believes that the book of Revelation was written in the reign of the Emperor Domitian around 96 AD. And obviously that's a pretty, even though that's not inspired what he said, it's fallible, it doesn't necessarily prove that the book is written earlier. Somebody who was connected so intimately to Polycarp, who was the disciple of John, he's only one generation removed from John. It's a pretty strong argument to say that the book of Revelation was probably written at that later period. And it also would make sense that if it's the last book written in the canon of Scripture, and it's the book of Revelation that talks about everything that happens at the end, leading up to the end of history. That kind of lines up too. So that, in my mind, makes a lot of sense. Now, that's once again, that doesn't necessarily prove my theory, but it would kind of, those thoughts kind of go together. And there are writings from other church fathers out when I was doing research for this. I think Clement of Rome said essentially the same thing as Irenaeus of Lyon. Now, I know that partial preterists have their argument, but from where I'm sitting, even though I do believe that the book of Revelation was written in 96 AD, if it was proven that it was written earlier, obviously I would probably want to go back and read more preterist literature than I already have. And I'm not an expert on it, but I have read a decent amount of it. Obviously, if I found out the book was dated earlier, I'd probably, if I was humble, I'd want to look at their stuff closer than I do, but it wouldn't disprove how I view the book of Revelation. Like how I interpret the book of Revelation is not dependent on the date of the book. So therefore, if that was proven to be different than how I view it, like all the ways I'm thinking about this isn't all just automatically unraveled because because that would be proven to be true. So yeah, the point I'm trying to make is the school of interpretation that I adhere to, historicism, is not dependent on an early or a late date of the book of Revelation. But I digress. But moving forward here, we come now to the structure of the book of Revelation. Now, the book of Revelation has 22 chapters, and I think it's a daunting book for most people, and it's and rightly so. It's a difficult book. There's a lot of symbolism in the book, and I think it's really fair to say that some chapters of it are much easier to understand than other chapters, and the great the great in Bible interpretation in general, the great principle is we interpret the more difficult passages in light of the easier to understand passages. We interpret the unclear in the light of the clear, and I think that's as true as much for Bible prophecy as much as it is for anything else. But obviously, having a good, before we try to get into all of the weeds of what these symbols mean, how we should interpret them, and getting into all of that, I think it's really good to just try to, and I would encourage everybody who's trying to understand this book to do this, try to look at just the timeline of all the symbolism and just kind of have it understand in your head. And before you apply any interpretation to it, just say, okay, there are the epistles, there are the seals, there are the trumpets, and there are the vials. And that's essentially what there is. So chapter 1 is an introduction, and then chapter 2 and 3, we have these epistles to 7 churches in Asia Minor. That's in modern day Turkey. If you look at a map of Turkey today, right on the Aegean, right to the east of Greece, you have that little loop, kind of, it's a peninsula, and then you have the Aegean Sea, and then you have Greece on the other side. In that portion of Asia Minor in Turkey, that's where these 7 churches were located. And the 7 epistles are written to these 7 churches. Now, I'll get back to that in a second. But then from chapters 4 to 6, we have a vision of heaven, of the Lamb, of Jesus Christ, and we have this majestic portrayal of heaven. And then it talks about the scroll that has 7 seals on it. And I'm paraphrasing this, but the only one who has the ability to open the scroll, which is the scroll of this prophecy, is Jesus Christ, is the Lamb. And the 7 seals are open one at a time, and that's really what we read in chapter 6 of the book. But according to the structure of the book, within the 7th seal are the 7 trumpets. So it's almost kind of like you zoom in on the trumpets. And then the 7 trumpets are blown, and that's really chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 7 is referring to the 144,000, but then 8 and 9, you get to the trumpets. And then you get to later you get the vials, and the 7 vials are contained in the 7th trumpet. So I know that may sound a little confusing, but let me say it like this. When the 7th vial is the bowls of wrath are poured upon the Antichrist system, when that 7th vial is completed, zooming back out, the 7th trumpet will be blown. And when the 7th trumpet is blown, zooming out a second time, the 7th seal will be fully opened, and then the prophecy will essentially be, for all intents and purposes, completed, even though there's the millennium and the latter state after. But that's kind of the structure of it. We have the epistles first, and then we have the seals, the trumpets, and then these vials or bowls of wrath. And the vials are in chapter 16. And really, to understand this, chapter 11 through 19, all of that is telling the story of the destruction of Antichrist. Chapter 11, you have kind of this picture of the church in the wilderness, and it's being you have the 2 witnesses, which I think portrays the church in the wilderness, and they're prophesying in ashes against this system of Antichrist. Chapter 12 talks more about that woman in the wilderness, which I think symbolizes the church. And then 13, you have the 2 beasts. This is a pretty famous chapter. You have the first beast and the second beast, and then you have, the mark of the beast and all that goes into that. And then 14, 15, and then 16, you have the vials in more detail. And then 17 is the woman riding the beast, which is really just a different portrayal of the same thing we're seeing in chapter 13. And 18 is the destruction of that system talked about in chapter 17. And in 19, we have the picture of Jesus defeating the armies of Antichrist. And then you get to chapters 20, which is chapter 20 talks about the millennium, and that's universally agreed upon. No matter how you define the millennium, everybody says the millennium is in chapter 20. And then 21 and 22 is talking about the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven and the new heavens and the new earth and the eternal state. And the only people who would really reject that that's talking about a future coming eternal state would be the full preterists. And I'm not even going to get into that right now. So that really is a summary of the entire book. But really, what I want everybody to remember is really these four. You have the epistles, the seals, the trumpets, and the vials. And there's seven of each of them, that's God's number of completion. So seven epistles, you have seven seals, seven trumpets, and seven vials. And if you're confused at this point, we're going to go into more detail talking about this as we move along. But that's really the structure of the book. So now we come to these epistles, and I'm going to kind of summarize them. I'm going to read a little bit from chapters 2 and 3. But yeah, we have these seven epistles written to to the seven churches in Asia Minor, and this is the opening of the book. Now, there's two ways that this is interpreted. Some people say, on the one hand, these are only epistles to the first century churches. They're not really prophetic, other than that they start the prophecy, but they're really not talking about anything that happens later in the church age. So it's kind of a straightforward view. There's not much prophecy beyond the literal epistles and descriptions to these churches. And then there's the second view that believes that these seven churches symbolize ages of church history. So within this church age, this age between the first coming of Christ and the eternal state, some interpreters hold that these seven churches actually symbolize seven church ages in this greater age of the last days. And I actually kind of think that that view makes sense. And I'm going to give some reasons why I think that in just a second. Now, it's interesting that there's a lot of futurists that hold that view. And so the way they will view the book of Revelation is that the seven epistles are kind of symbolizing the church age leading up to the Great Tribulation. And then chapters 4 through 22 is talking about the 7 year tribulation, the premillennial coming of Christ, the millennium, and the eternal state. So you kind of see there's a method to their madness, and I would kind of my understanding of the church ages thing is a little bit different than them. But sometimes I've listened to futurists kind of talk about their view of the church ages, and like they got a point in some ways, in my opinion. Like I said in the last video I made, all the schools, they got their pluses and minuses. If you're humble and you glean, there's things a lot of people say that make sense. But I also want to say, though, my favorite commentary on the book of Revelation is this is Wilhelmus of Brockles in his commentary on the book of Revelation, called "Not to Be Ignored." If you want a book on a commentary on Revelation, I'd highly recommend getting this one because it's pretty easy to read. You probably can't see it here, but it's not too hard. It's really good from the historicist post-millennial school. That's the view I hold, and it's really easy to read. But the way a Brockle defines the epistles is he would disagree with this church ages idea. So I just wanted to show this as an example. Even in the historicist school, not everybody holds that view. And I'm going to say this with all of these four, the epistles, the seals, the trumpets, and the vials. There's going to be different ways to interpret this stuff, and that's okay. We don't need to be so dogmatic that we're throwing stones at people that view this stuff differently. Like I said multiple times at this point, there's a lot of symbolism. It gets complicated. So if you're looking at what I'm saying, you're saying, Joe, I love you, man, but I don't understand where you're coming from at all. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So the church ages view, even amongst historicists, some hold it, some don't. There's debate about it, but I do kind of think, in my mind, it makes sense that this prophecy, because a lot of the prophetic events, in my opinion, are really political events. And the reason for that is God is judging these empires and this antichrist system according to, he deprives them of what they wanted, which is wealth and power. So for a lot of the book, you see that. But it kind of makes sense to me that he would describe the spiritual strengths and weaknesses of the church from a more spiritual perspective, and that would be shown through these seven epistles. And it makes sense to me that that could be characterizing the strengths and weaknesses of the church in various ages. And when you really get into the nitty gritty of it, it really does make sense. But In order to kind of summarize this view, I want to read a quotation from John Gill, who is one of my favorite theologians. And this is from his commentary on Revelation 120. You can look this up on Google pretty easily. If you Google Revelation 120, John Gill, it'll come right up. And then I'm going to read the section here. He said this is the part of the verse that says, "And the seven candlesticks which thou sawest are the seven churches." And then these are the words of Gill here I'm reading next. And he says, "These represent the seven churches of Asia, and in them all the churches of Christ in successive ages to the end of time. The reason why they are signified by candlesticks is that they are prophetic of the churches of Christ in several periods of time until he comes again, and will appear from the following considerations. The whole book is called a prophecy and a revelation of things that were shortly to come to pass. And it would be very strange and very unsuitable to its title should under the first three chapters contain nothing prophetic in them at all. The character of the divine person under which these seven churches are saluted, as he which is and was and is to come, the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, show that the things written to them belong to the gospel church state from the beginning to the end of it. For what other reason could be given for such a peculiar use of them?" And then he goes on and on. Let me see here. Yeah, he gives more reasons, but I'm not going to get into all of that. But that gives a good summary of where Gill was coming from. He really did see that these seven churches are, I think these epistles, in my opinion, and I'm really following Gill's thoughts here, is that he saw them and I saw them as first and primarily these seven epistles were letters that were actually written to the actual first century churches, and that they are primarily in the most literal sense talking directly about the specific churches which they were written to in the first century. But in a prophetic or a typological sense, there's symbolism here that would indicate that they are reflective of greater church ages. Now, some of you guys, like I said, may agree with that. Some may disagree with that. But that being said, I'm going to give a summary of these seven churches, and then I'm going to read some passages of scripture and pull things out, and then we're going to be done. We're going to be done from there. So we have these seven churches in Asia Minor. We have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So we have seven of them, and it's interesting when you read them. All of these epistles talk about the strengths and weaknesses of these churches, and of these churches, there's two that really don't have any type of rebuke in them at all, and that's going to be Smyrna and Philadelphia. And the other five, there's to varying degrees, there's commendations of what they do well in these epistles, but there is also rebukes over where they are sinning or where they are performing poorly. So Ephesus, it says that they started off well, but they left their first love. And I'll talk about that more in a bit. Now, Smyrna, their description is that there's heavy persecution amongst the brethren at that church, which I think was literally talking about what that church was going through in the first century. But I also, in my opinion, kind of think that it's talking about the persecution of the Christian church under the pagan Roman Empire. And then you have Pergamos and Thyatira. Thyatira is really interesting because you have this Jezebel woman who came into the church, who turned the church toward fornication and idols, so toward sexual immorality and idolatry, which it's really hard for me not to see that description of this Jezebel woman coming into the church to be prophetic of the apostasy of Roman Catholicism coming into the professing church. I think that's prophetically looking to the reign of the false church system, the false seductress woman that really was at its peak in the Middle Ages. And then Sardis is described as being spiritually dead, which I think kind of from the Reformation to our day, there's parallels to that. And then Philadelphia is the church of brotherly love. This is the church where it's described as having God opens the door which cannot be opened or shut by anybody else. And this church is described as having great spiritual success. And it's given success that the other churches are not given to. And I think that's talking about how things will be for the church in the millennial period. That's my opinion. And then Laodicea is described as being lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, and Christ says he would vomit it from its mouth. This church was caught up in its riches. I actually personally think it's describing the state of the church in that final period after the millennium, the little season when Jesus Christ comes back. That's my opinion of it, but people may disagree with that. But with Ephesus, I think Ephesus is talking. We have more information about Ephesus than really any other church because it talked about so much in the New Testament. This is the church where Timothy pastored. Timothy was mentored by Paul. He was really brought into the ministry under Paul's leadership, and he really becomes one of the pastors, the elders at Ephesus. And we know that Paul talks about Ephesus. We see it in Acts chapter 20, where he had spent time with this church and he had wept over it. He feared that grievous wolves are going to come into the church. We can read about that in Acts chapter 20. And then we also, in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, they're written by Paul to Timothy. Those are called the pastoral epistles. And Timothy was the pastor at Ephesus. So we have a lot of information about this church. And Ephesus is a church where there was a pagan, a very prominent pagan temple there. The Greeks called it the temple. There was a temple to Artemis, and then the Romans called it the temple of Diana, which is the same gods. It's the same deities under a different name. The Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses is really identical to the Greek one. They just had different names for these gods and goddesses. So Artemis would be Diana. Another example is that Zeus is referred to as Jupiter, and I could give other examples. But so this was the historical context of this church is that it has a lot of paganism that was in this city, and this church started off very well, and it over time it even though it had done many good works, it really lost its first love. It lost its love of Christ. So I think some of that zeal really waned. So I'm going to turn to this in Revelation chapter 2, and I'm going to just read this. And just to say, I think that the church at Ephesus is describing, in my opinion, is prophesying this church age of the apostolic age. So the New Testament period from the resurrection of Christ and Christ going back into heaven and the death of the apostles. I think that's the church age that is being prophesied by the Ephesian church state. And that would make sense because, well, there's really not much future prophecy. It's describing the contemporaneous period in which it was written. But it says, this is chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write these things, saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. I know thy works and thy labor and thy patience, and how thou cannot bear them which are evil, and thou hast tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and hast found them liars, and has borne and has patience, and has for my name's sake has labored and has not fainted. Nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. Remember therefore from whence thou art fallen, and repent, and do the first works, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and remove thy candlestick out of its place, except thou repent. But thou hast, and thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches, plural. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. Now, another thing I just want to say real quick, as I was reading this, I was reminded these 7 epistles are clearly written for the edification of the entire church through the entire church age. The universal church Christians in all eras, all times, all places are supposed to read these epistles and glean the instruction and the knowledge and the wisdom from them. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove the church ages view I'm laying out, but it certainly is an interesting thought. But like I said, Ephesus had a very mixed report. They clearly had done some things well. They had labored in good deeds. They had not fainted even despite opposition and even persecution. And they had opposed the false apostles that had tried to come into their church. And that's really interesting because that lines up with what Paul said about grievous wolves back in Acts chapter 20. And then it talks about how the Ephesians hated the false deeds of the Nicolaitans, which was this false religious sect that had tried to infiltrate into the Christian church. They're talked about more in the rest of these epistles. So we see here that they did some things well, but they had backslidden. And now true Christians can backslide where you can lag in your zeal, you can lag in your fervency in prayer, you can lag in your time in the scriptures, you can lag behind in your love and devotion and service to God, and you don't have that same pep in your step, that same fire in your heart and in your soul that you had when you're first converted. I think every mature Christian listening to this video or me speaking, we've all been in that place of being backslidden, and we all need to, by the grace of God, be revived and repent and go back to that wellspring of life that we find in Jesus Christ. We've all been there. And that's what Ephesus was happening. So they hadn't completely given over to apostasy. It's not that they weren't doing anything good anymore, but a lot of that spiritual life had kind of degraded down in that state of being backslidden. So it's important for them to understand that they are given a mixed report. Their report isn't as harsh as, say, Sardis, which we're going to read about later, and it's not as commendable as Smyrna or Philadelphia. Those are the two that really have no rebuke in them at all. So that brings me next to Smyrna, and I'm going to read the prophecy of Smyrna here in a sec, but we're going to see that they're described as having gone through much hardship, much persecution. And in my opinion, like I said before, I think this church is prophesying the church age of persecution under the Roman emperors following the end of the apostolic age. So the apostles are believed to have died off around 100 AD. So the first century AD is the time of the apostles. But from the second century on to the time of Constantine, there were numerous persecutions. Under the five good emperors, there was persecution. Under later, the worst one was under Diocletian. But yeah, under the 200s and the all the way up to 313 BC. So from 100 AD to 313 AD, it's a period of about 200 years. There were a series of successive persecutions under the Roman Empire of the Christians, and they got increasingly intense as time went on. And I think this is the time period in history that is being typologically or prophetically foreshadowed by the epistle at Smyrna. And now the Roman Empire, they were a very multicultural state in one sense, but they had a view that they said, as long as you pay your taxes and you give your veneration to Caesar, who they saw as he was the chief, the Pontifex Maximus of the Roman pagan religion, and he was often venerated as a god. Really, Julius, when you go back to Julius Caesar, who technically wasn't the first emperor, but he was the dictator of Rome, who really brought in the reign of the emperors, he really kind of claimed this divine lineage from the gods. And when he had his triumph following his victory in the Roman civil wars, he painted his face red with a glint of purple. This is foreshadowing the imperial purple, the color of the emperors. And he really was kind of depicting, or at least hinting at, that he was a descendant of Jupiter or of the gods. He didn't necessarily come outright and claim it, but there was this cult of Julius Caesar veneration that arose up. And this set a trend in Roman society that the Caesars, the Augustuses, there was a cult of worship that rose up around them. So, but the Romans, their policy was, you can worship whatever gods you want, as long as you acknowledge the state Roman pagan religion, and you give your veneration to the Caesars, to the Augustuses, because Augustus was the first emperor. He's the nephew of Julius Caesar that got adopted as his heir, and he won the final stage of the Roman civil wars against Mark Antony, and he became Caesar. He became the ruler of the entire Roman Empire. So the Caesars, or sometimes they would be also referred to as Augustus, but the Romans had this religious policy that if you gave veneration to the Caesars and you gave veneration to the Roman gods, you can worship whatever other gods you want. And since most of the rest of the Roman Empire was pagan, it's a policy of syncretism. Most people who are pagans, they're like, okay, whatever, no big deal. But if you were a Jew in Judea and then later the Christians who rose up, but especially who were monotheists, this was not a good deal. Like they couldn't accept it. Um, Now the Jew, if you read about the history of Judea, there was kind of a very interesting relationship. How some of the Jews tried to say, well, what if we pay the taxes and we give honor to it, but we don't go into the polytheism? This is the same type of kind of tug pull relationship they had when they were under Greek rule, under in the time of the Maccabees. But the Christians, they got persecuted really bad because of the fact that they could not adhere to that policy of syncretism. They could not give veneration to Caesar, and they couldn't give veneration to the Roman pagan state religion. They couldn't worship the gods like Jupiter or Diana, these Roman gods. So therefore, they were really stuck, and therefore they were persecuted. And I think the church in Smyrna, they were prophesying this time period in history. Now I'll read the section here on Smyrna, and you can see whether you agree or disagree with me. And this is starting in verse 8, and it says, unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write these things, saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of these things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches, plural. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. So here it's talking about how this church of Smyrna, they were very impoverished, they had a lot of tribulation, and that some of their members were cast into prison. Now, some people may or may not agree that it could be prophetically looking forward to the persecution of the church, but the imagery is there, and I find that very, very interesting. And now we come next to Pergamos, and Pergamos was the church that is the third of the seven, and it says that if we're going to read this, that says that they have the seat, they are the seat of Satan in their city. Now, when you look up the history of Pergamos, it's really, really interesting that there was this massive altar to Zeus. Now, Zeus was the chief god of the Greek pantheon. The Greek pantheon centered around Mount Olympus, and he's the thunder god. And I think it's not incidental that it's referred to as the seat of Satan here because of the fact that Zeus is really the same as Satan. Now, because all of these gods and all these different there's real entities behind all these idols. These real entities are fallen angels. They're worshipped by the nations under different names. And I've talked about this a lot on my channel. There's a lot of Christian researchers out there who have talked about this a lot on their channels or in their books and their videos, whatever else. But I really think that Baal, the god Baal, the Babylonian or Mesopotamian god, he's a storm god, a thunder god. Zeus, and even a Norse god like Thor, they're all thunder gods. I think it's all the same entity. And I think it's all really they're really essentially, they're all Satan, essentially. So, and once I heard Derek Gilbert say this and he made me laugh. He said, sorry, kids, Thor is Satan. He was talking about the Marvel movies, the Disney movies. And I think he's right. I think he's right about that. And I think there's this other entity called Semyaza who got thrown down into the bottomless pit in Sheol. The Watchers got imprisoned there. I've talked about that a lot in my videos recently. That the Watchers they were cast down into Sheol at the time of the Great Flood, and I think in these pantheons that this guy Shemiyaza is a different entity than Satan altogether. But I don't want to get too far into that because it's going to get confusing and I'd have to break all that down. But I think that this giant altar to Zeus that was in Pergamos is what is being talked about here with this seat of Satan. But I also think it is prophetically or typologically pointing forward to the rise of Antichrist that was coming onto the scene from the time of Constantine in 313 AD. Because if you guys know the history, Constantine, he won his own civil war. He became the Caesar of the United Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire went through a time of decline, and there were civil wars in its history before it eventually finally fell. But Constantine and his civil war, this is centuries after the earlier civil wars, he was able to reunite. He was able to get all of it under his own rule. He fought this battle at Milvian Bridge, and he claims to have seen a cross sign in the sky, and he claims to have this conversion to Christianity. Now, Christians today, they vehemently debate whether he was truly saved or was he an infiltrator of Satan into the church. There's a lot of debate about Constantine. He's kind of a controversial figure amongst Christians, amongst evangelical Protestant Christians. And oh, that's a difficult subject. But this is what I'll say for sure. He professed a conversion to Christ, but he never forsook his role as the head of the pagan Roman priesthood, the Pontifex Maximus. So, I mean, I think a lot of this corruption, this paganism, this idolatry, it took centuries for it to come into the church. But I think Constantine's kind of a forerunner to the Pope, but I don't think he necessarily started it all up. It's kind of a complicated mixed bag. Whether he sincerely thought he had come to Christ or not, I don't know. It's interesting. He wasn't baptized till his deathbed. There's a lot of interesting history. But I do think that there were inconsistencies with him because I think to be a Christian, and he never really forsook some of that paganism, um, he's a complicated guy. But I will say this, though, that at least initially, he did the persecutions of Christians that were going on under the pagans, they did lift for a time. And that's kind of similar to what happened when the Soviet Union broke up. The Christians that had been persecuted by the communists, that stopped. So in the province of God, there was good things that happened. But then what happened was that he's really responsible for what a lot of historians call the Constantinian change. There's a mouthful for you. The Constantinian change. And there was really the beginning of this this marriage between Christianity and the Roman state started under Constantine. And it eventually kind of led to sects that were outside of the hierarchy of that professed Catholic Church that came into being. They got persecuted. So the pagan persecution stopped, but eventually a new type of persecution rose up in groups like the Novatians, who split off from the quote Catholic Church, or especially the Donatists in North Africa. They faced persecutions, and even Augustine famously said he held the view that the church should be used to forcibly, the sword of the magistrate should be used to forcibly bring them back into communion with the Catholics. And Augustine lived in the 300s and 400s AD. So there's a lot of complicated history. And I think God providentially used Constantine's conversion to Christianity and rise to power to stop the persecution of Christians, at least for a time. But there's also a lot of things he did that sowed the seeds of a lot of discourse. Now, if your guys' views on Augustine, if you have your thoughts on it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how you view that, because that's a really interesting time in history. But anyway, getting back to my main point, though, I think that Pergamos, this seed of Satan, is prophesying this next stage in church history, really from like around 313 AD, the time of Constantine, up until about 800 AD. And this is the time when the idolatry started to come into the church at an accelerated rate. The veneration of Mary starts to come into the church, and we start to get the formation of the doctrinal errors that really form the medieval Catholic Church that we eventually get. Now, some of these errors, some of this idolatry and paganism, started even earlier. I mean, Paul in Second Thessalonians 2 says that the mystery of iniquity is already at work. I mean, even in these epistles we're reading in the first century, it's talking about groups like the Nicolaitans, and it's talking about those who profess to be Jews that are part of the synagogue of Satan. There were errors coming in the first century. But after Constantine, it all accelerates. And then, the images really get established in the church by the 8th century. Um, I think it's the Second Council of Nicaea. It's like um, it's 774 AD. It's in there. In the 8th century, you really get the images are officially recognized as being a part of the worship of the Christian church. There was a centuries-long debate that went on. You can read different church fathers that had different views. But I think this church age of Pergamos, the seed of Satan, is really talking about the rise of these errors coming into the church. And then I think the next one we're going to read, Thyatira, is talking about the medieval reign of Antichrist. And we're going to talk about that more as we move along. Now, I'm at 50 minutes here. I think I'm going to finish Pergamos and Thyatira, and I'm going to stop this video because I'm trying to keep them from getting too long, guys. So we'll probably finish the epistles and go to the seals in the next one. But yeah, we're at 50 minutes here. So I'm gonna do these two, and then we'll go from there. So we're at verse 12 here, and it says, and to the angel of the church in Pergamos write these things, saith he hath the sharp sword with two edges. I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even in Satan's seat is. So that's what I was talking about. This is where Satan's seat is. This giant altar to Zeus. I think that's the historical context that explains this epistle. So, and okay, recapping. Even where Satan's seat is, and thou holdest fast my name, and has not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwells. I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold to the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit fornication. So hast thou also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which I hate. Repent, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches, plural. To him that I overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth, saving that he hath received it. So just really quickly here, we see this is where Satan's seed is said to be. I explained that. But then it talks about how the doctrine of the Nicolaitans is coming into this church. It's talking about how they're falling into the error of Balaam. They're eating things sacrificed to idols. And it's saying fornication and idolatry are starting to come into the church. So that is specifically why I think it's prophesying this church age, specifically in church history, where those things were coming into the church. And I think the next one, Thyatira, is really the consummation of that. So Pergamos is the rise of these errors into the church, and then Thyatira is talking about the age in church history where that system of idolatry and error is really at its zenith of power. And this is really referring to the reign of the popes and the Roman Catholic system, which was at the peak of its power in the Middle Ages. So obviously we know that the Roman Empire falls in 475 or 476 AD. And then 800 AD, we have the rise of Charlemagne, who is crowned by the Pope, the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD. And it's kind of this revival of the Roman Empire in the West, even though it never recaptures the true glory of Rome. But that's kind of what it was intended. And it's kind of a rival in the West of the Eastern Byzantine Empire, because the Eastern Roman Empire had survived when the Western Roman Empire had fell. But anyway, Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, they're crowned by the Pope. So it gets to a point in history where the bishops of Rome's power increased over the centuries. So by the time you get to 800 AD, it's gotten to the point where the Pope actually he gets his own country that's called the Papal States. And Charlemagne went down and helped conquer the enemies of the Pope in Italy. And that really, oh yeah, that's what happened in 74 AD. The Second Council of Nicaea is 787 AD. I bet if you look it up, I bet I'm right. I just remember that. So the dusty storage in the storage bin, the files came back up to the front of the brain. So I just remember that because I was like, no, 774. That's when Charlemagne went down, and he defeated. He helped finish defeating the Lombards, and he helped the Pope get that territory in Italy, and he helped the Papal States come into formation at that time. There was what was called the donation of Pepin, which came before Charlemagne, but Charlemagne's the one who kind of finishes that process. And then it gets to the point where the Pope is actually able to crown Charlemagne the Holy Roman Empire. So we have a Pope having the authority to crown kings. And this is really it gets to the point by the time you get to the Middle Ages, The church and state is yoked together completely, and we're going to see this in the two beasts in Revelation 13. And we get to the point where the popes actually have authority and power over the kings of Europe. So that is what happens. That is the church age of Thyatira. That's the final one we're going to look at and read. I think all of that is prophesied by this church age of Thyatira. It's the prophesying the age of the Middle Ages from 800 AD up until the time of the Protestant Reformation, which the official start to the Protestant Reformation is 1517. So a period of about 700 years. I'm going to read the Thyatira one and comment on it, and then we'll be done. So unto the angel of the church in Thyatira write these things, saith the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. I know thy works, and charity, and service, and faith, and thy patience, and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication and eat things sacrificed unto idols. And I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. Behold, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit idolatry with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. And I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he which searches the reins and hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. But unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan as they speak, I will put upon you none other burden. But that which you have already hold fast till I come. He that overcomes, keep my words unto the end. To him will I give power unto the nations, and he shall rule them with the rod of iron, as vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I receive my Father, and I will give him the morning star. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. We've seen that said again and again. I think that's really important. Like, there's words of wisdom that all of us Christians need to understand and glean. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, first off, this is a literal description of what happened in Thyatira. And when you think about that, that's crazy. This woman, Jezebel, who was a false prophetess, came in and she got the church to fall into eating things sacrificed unto idols. And I think the implication is they were getting footsie with idolatry in general. Like those lines of separation that were not supposed to be crossed, they're clearly starting to get crossed, and they eventually do get crossed. And then fornication, which is that word for sexual immorality. So we have like sexual immorality, that's really bad. Idolatry, that's really bad. This lady led this church into this church, into this apostasy, into this paganism, and God saying, I gave her a chance to repent in the province of God. Jesus is saying this. She didn't do it. And he's pretty much saying this woman is an enemy of God, and anybody who's yoked up with her, this system of idolatry, is going to go through great tribulation. This is not going to be good for your soul. This is not a good thing. This is a story. This is what literally happened. That's crazy. I think we all would agree that these are epistles to the real churches. So when you think that that's the story of what happened, that's pretty nutty. But I think this is also prophesying this system of idolatry that reigned over the professing church in the Middle Ages, and that most people were given over to it. And when you look at the medieval Roman Catholic system, and it's still present in the modern day, the veneration of the saints, the veneration of Mary, the use of the statues and the images, even though Roman Catholic apologists deny that that's all idolatry, it is. And that's a video for another day. But the Bible really, really, really condemns those things. And in this specific epistle, we see this stuff going on. So in my mind, it makes sense that's what this church is prophesying. So we've gone from the first century AD all the way up to about the Protestant Reformation. That's what we're going to pick off next time. So we'll do the last three epistles: Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, and then we're going to come up more in the modern age, and then we'll do the seals in the next video, and that will probably take 45 minutes to an hour. but we'll go from there. So, hey, let me know what you think. Let me know what you like about the series. Let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, my email is always listed on my website. You can get a hold of me there. So I hope you guys have enjoyed part 2 of this series on the book of Revelation. This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Through Ministries. God bless everybody. If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.